My name is Thomas Hale. I am 58 years old, and 14 months ago, on a cobblestone street in Lisbon, Portugal, I saw my dead wife buying flowers from a market stall. She was laughing at something the man beside her had said. She was wearing a blue dress I had never seen. Her hair was shorter than I remembered. She looked from 20 feet away on a narrow street in a city I had traveled to specifically because I had never been there and had no memories of it, exactly like the woman I had buried 9 years ago, because she was that woman. My name is Thomas Hale, and this is the story of the afternoon my wife came back from the dead, and what she said to me when I walked up to her on that street, and what happened in the hours and weeks and months after that, and why I am only now able to tell it without my voice doing something I cannot control. Let me start at the beginning, the real beginning, not the Lisbon Street, because the Lisbon Street only makes sense if you know what came before it. Her name was Catherine Marie Hale, née Forsyth, born in 1969 in a small city in western North Carolina, to a school teacher and an electrician. I met her in 1991 at a mutual friend's birthday party in Charlotte when I was 24 and she was 22, and she was standing near a window arguing about something with a level of certainty that I found immediately and completely more attractive than anything I had encountered before. I do not remember what she was arguing about. I remember the way she held her glass, and the way she turned her head when she was making a point, and the way she looked at me when our mutual friend introduced us, like she was deciding something quickly, and had almost decided. We were married in 1994. We lived in Charlotte until 1998, then moved to Raleigh, when I took a position with a regional insurance brokerage that needed someone to build out their commercial lines division. We had one daughter, Emma, born in 1996, who is now 28 years old and lives in Edinburgh with a man named Callum, who teaches secondary school mathematics and who I like very much because he is honest and careful, and Emma seems genuinely happy in a way that is not performed. Catherine and I had, by most external measures, a good marriage. I want to be precise about what I mean by that because it matters. We did not have a perfect marriage. We argued. We went through periods where we were parallel rather than connected, running adjacent lives in the same house without the friction that indicates real contact. There was a stretch in the early 2000s when Emma was 6 or 7 where I worked too much, and Catherine felt it and said so, and I heard it, but did not change enough, and she eventually stopped saying it, and I thought that meant the problem had resolved, and it had not resolved. It had simply gone underground. I know that now. I knew it at some level then, but we also had the real thing, the texture of a shared life that had lasted long enough to have its own grammar, its own private language, the shorthand of two people who have been paying attention to each other for a long time. She knew that I was always cold in movie theaters, and she always brought a jacket for me without being asked. I knew that she needed 20 minutes of quiet when she came home from work before she was ready to talk, and I gave her that without making her ask for it. We had inside jokes that had been running so long neither of us could remember the original context. We had a Sunday morning routine that we had kept without discussion for 15 years. Coffee before anything else, then the newspaper, then whatever needed to happen. We had, I thought, a life. And life, when it is going in the direction you have agreed upon, has a way of making itself legible. The shape of Tuesday is the shape of Tuesday. The rhythms of a household become so embedded that you stop noticing them. The way you stop noticing the sound of a clock in a familiar room. Catherine and I had built that. 17 years of Tuesdays and school pickups and grocery runs and vacations that were mostly good and occasionally not, and the ordinary accumulation of decisions large and small that constitute, in aggregate, a shared existence. I was not unhappy. I want to be clear about that, because in the version of this story that is easiest to tell, I was living inside something hollow and did not know it. And the truth is more complicated than that. I was not unhappy. I was living inside something that had once been full and was gradually, incrementally, almost imperceptibly becoming less so. The way a room loses light so slowly in the late afternoon that you do not notice until you try to read and find you cannot see the page. There were years when we were genuinely good. The year Emma was born, which was also the year we moved to the bigger house, was a year I look back on with something close to pure affection. We were tired in the way of new parents, but we were also present with each other in a way we had not been in the years just before, when work had consumed most of what we both had available. Emma arrived and reorganized our priorities in the way that children do when they are new and require everything, and for a while the requirement of everything was the thing that kept us oriented toward each other. The years after were what they were, not bad, not consciously diminishing, simply the gradual evolution of a marriage from something made of intention to something maintained by habit. And the question that we never quite asked each other, or not directly, was whether habit was enough. I believe we both knew the answer. I believe we arrived at it independently and at different times, and neither of us raised our hand. That is the honest account of what we were. Not a great love that tragedy severed. A real and flawed and human partnership that had been running on diminishing reserves for longer than either of us had been willing to name. In March of 2015, Catherine flew to Chicago for a 3-day conference on healthcare administration. She worked in healthcare consulting, had done so for 12 years, and the Chicago conference was an annual event she had attended several times before. She flew out on a Monday morning. I drove her to the airport. She kissed me at the departures entrance and said she would call when she landed and she would be back Thursday afternoon, and she loved me. She did not call when she landed. I thought nothing of it for several hours. She was busy. She was in a conference. She had landed and gone straight into sessions and would call that evening when she was back in the hotel. I made dinner for myself, something simple, and I watched television, and at 9 o'clock she had not called, and I tried her phone, and it went to voicemail, and I left a message and went to bed. At 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of my phone. It was a hospital in Chicago. There had been an accident on the highway, a rental car registered under the name of her firm's travel account. I need to stop here for a moment and tell you that I have described this next part many times over the years in the immediate aftermath, to investigators, to the insurance company, to a grief counselor I saw for 8 months after, to Emma when she was old enough to hear it fully. And each time I have told it, I have had to decide how much of what it felt like I am willing to put into words. What it felt like was that the floor of the world dropped away and did not come back. The accident was on the expressway north of the city, a multi-vehicle collision in wet conditions. The rental car was hit from behind at speed and struck the median barrier. The woman in the car was identified by the identification in her purse, her driver's license, her credit cards, her work badge. Catherine Marie Hale. The body was burned extensively in the fire that followed the collision. Dental records were requested and provided by our dentist in Raleigh. They matched. She was buried in Raleigh on a Wednesday in April. Emma was 18, in her first year of college, and she came home for the funeral, and she stood beside me at the graveside with the specific stillness of a young person who has not yet developed the coping architecture for what they are experiencing. I held her hand the entire time. I did not look at the coffin more than I had to. The grief that followed was the geography of my life for the next 2 years. I am not going to describe it in full because grief at that depth is not a thing that translates well into language, and because the people in my life in those 2 years, Emma and my brother Richard, and a handful of friends who showed up without being asked and kept showing up, deserve more credit than a description of my internal state can give them. What I will say is that I functioned. I went back to work after 6 weeks. I made Emma's college visits when she needed them and was present at her graduation and at her decision to move to Scotland with Callum. And I was, I believe, a present and adequate father in the years that followed, which is not the same as being okay, but is what was available. What grief does to time is the thing that nobody tells you accurately in advance. It does not slow time or speed it. It bends it. The first year of grief contains within it a specific distortion where the most recent normal memory, the last Tuesday that was simply Tuesday, without the weight of everything that came after, feels both very close and completely unreachable. I would wake at 3 in the morning, and for 2 or 3 seconds the house was simply the house, and Catherine was simply asleep beside me. And then the present arrived again, and it arrived the way it always arrives, without mercy and without adjustment. I went to a grief counselor for 8 months. Her name was Dr. Patricia Elwood, and she was 62, and had the specific quality of listening that I have only encountered in people who have either done enormous amounts of therapeutic training or lived through something large themselves. And in her case, I suspected both. She said to me in the 3rd session that grief was not primarily about the dead. It was about the surviving self, the version of you that had organized itself around another person and now had to reorganize. I had resisted that framing initially because it felt selfish, like making Catherine's death about me. She said correctly that that was exactly the point. I thought about that sentence for the rest of the time I was seeing her and for years afterward. The surviving self, the version of me that had oriented itself by a fixed point, and then the fixed point was gone, and what remained was not directionless exactly, but unanchored in the specific way that means you are always slightly surprised to find yourself where you are. I managed. That is the honest word. I managed the way competent people manage difficulty, which is not by resolving it, but by building enough structure around it that the daily business of living can proceed. I worked. I had dinner with Richard twice a month. I called Emma on Sundays. I maintained the house and had the car serviced and attended the neighborhood association meetings that I had always attended because Catherine had cared about the neighborhood, and after she died, I kept caring about it on her behalf and eventually on my own, which I think is how we absorb what we lose by continuing to do the things they did until the things belong to us. I sold the house in Raleigh 3 years after Catherine died. The house had been ours, and I could not make it mine alone, and I was not going to spend another 5 years trying. I moved into a smaller house on the east side of Raleigh, a house with no associations, no rooms that had been arranged by someone else, no dimensions calibrated to a life that no longer existed. I kept working. The brokerage had been acquired by a larger firm in 2018, and I moved with it into a senior advisory role that required less time than my previous position and paid adequately and left me enough space to do the reading and the occasional woodworking that had become the texture of my private life. I did not date, not from loyalty to a dead woman, or not only from that. Also, from a more practical understanding that I was not, for several years, in a condition that was fair to offer to another person. By the time I was 57, I had arrived at something that felt, if not like peace, then like the settled version of grief, the kind that has been worn smooth by time and no longer has sharp edges. I thought about Catherine in the way you think about someone who has been part of you for a long time and is now absent, the way you think about a room in a house that was filled with something essential and is now quiet, but not empty. I had not been to Lisbon. I had been to Europe twice, once early in the marriage, and once with Emma when she was 12, but not to Portugal. A colleague at work mentioned it, almost in passing, as the kind of city that did something to you if you went alone, that it required solitude to receive properly. I booked a trip for 10 days in September of the year I turned 58. 10 days with nothing scheduled except the city. I want to tell you about the first 4 days because they matter for what happens on the 5th. Lisbon is a city that undoes you gently. That is the best way I can describe it. It does not overwhelm. It does not announce itself. It presents itself quietly and in pieces, around corners, at the top of hills, in the light on the water at certain hours that is not like light anywhere else I have stood. I walked for miles every day. I ate alone at small restaurants, and nobody thought anything of it. I took the old trams because they were there, and because the motion and the sound of them moved through neighborhoods in a way that felt like the city was showing you itself at its own pace rather than yours. On the second day, I found a small bookshop in the Chiado neighborhood that sold books in 6 languages and was staffed by a woman of approximately 70 who appeared to be reading 3 books simultaneously, and who, when I asked in careful, slow English if she had anything in history, looked at me over her glasses and asked, "What kind of history?" I said, "Old." She said, "That is all history," and took me to a section in the back and handed me 2 books without discussion, and I bought both of them and read one of them on a bench in a garden that afternoon. And it was one of the more purely satisfying afternoons I had spent in recent memory. On the 3rd day, it rained, and I stayed in and read the second book and ordered soup from a place that delivered and watched the rain on the narrow street from my window. The street was exactly the width of 2 people walking side by side. The buildings were tiled in the blue and white azulejos that Lisbon puts everywhere, the glazed decorative tiles that have been on the walls of this city for 500 years, and that look in the rain, like they belong to the weather, like the city has been designed to receive water and return it as something beautiful. On the 4th day, the rain had stopped, and the city was washed, and the light was the particular light that follows rain in a warm city, low and bronze and aware of itself, and I walked for 4 hours without a destination and arrived eventually at a small restaurant near the river where I had the best grilled fish I had eaten in the previous decade and a glass of local wine that a man at the next table recommended without being asked, which I had learned was a Lisbon habit, the unrequested and entirely correct recommendation, and I sat there until the evening began and then walked back to the hotel along the waterfront with the Tagus on my left and the city rising up on my right, and I thought, I should have come here years ago. I was happy. I want to say that clearly because it matters for everything that follows. For the first time in a long time, I was simply happy, present in a place without the weight of the years behind it. A man in a beautiful city with nothing required of him for 10 days. On the 5th day, I walked into the Alfama neighborhood in the early afternoon. It is the oldest part of the city, tight streets climbing steeply from the river, houses painted in fading colors, with laundry lines strung between windows and cats on every warm surface. I had walked in from the south, and I came around a corner into a small market. Half a dozen stalls selling flowers and vegetables and handmade tiles, and the specific clutter of things that have been made by hand and are being offered without particular urgency. I saw her from 20 feet away. I want to be exact about the sequence because the sequence matters. I saw a woman in a blue dress with shorter hair than I remembered standing at a flower stall. I registered her as a woman in a blue dress. My eye moved on and came back, and I registered something about the posture, the way she held her shoulders, the specific angle of her head when she was considering something. My eye came back a third time, and I stopped walking. The brain has a way of processing recognition that precedes understanding. I knew something before I knew what I knew. The signal arrived before the interpretation. Then she turned her head to say something to the man beside her, and I saw her face. The world did several things at once. My body stopped moving without a decision being made. The sound of the market, which had been present and ordinary, receded. Something happened to my vision at the edges. I stood on that cobblestone street, and I looked at my dead wife, standing 20 feet away buying dahlias from a market stall in Lisbon, Portugal, 9 years after I had identified her remains and buried her in Raleigh, North Carolina. I stood there for what was probably 30 seconds and may have been longer. The man beside her I took in peripherally because he was there and he was real. Taller than me, 60s perhaps, well-dressed in the casual way of someone who has lived somewhere warm long enough to understand what the weather actually requires. Gray at the temples. He was looking at the flower she was considering with the specific attention of a man who is genuinely interested in what the woman beside him is thinking. She bought the dahlias, 3 stems. The vendor wrapped them in paper, and she held them against her chest in the way she had always held flowers. I remembered it with absolute precision. The paper against the left side of her chest and her right hand holding the stems loosely from below. It was such a specific thing, such a small and private detail from the interior of a shared life. The way she held flowers. Nobody knows that about a person unless they have been in 1,000 ordinary rooms with them, unless they have watched them at flower stalls and farmers' markets and the table of a restaurant where someone brought a single stem in a thin vase and she picked it up to smell it and held it that particular way. 9 years, and I had not forgotten it. The body keeps records that the mind does not always have access to, and standing on that cobblestone street, I felt every one of them arrive at once. I walked toward her. I do not remember making the decision to walk toward her. I remember being 20 feet away and then being 8 feet away and then being close enough that if she turned, she would see my face. I remember the sound of the market was still there, children and vendors and the clatter of someone stacking tiles, all of it continuing normally the way ordinary life continues normally, inside extraordinary moments, indifferent and unhurried, because the world does not pause for what is happening to you. I remember the cobblestones under my shoes. I remember a cat on a low wall to my left, watching me with the specific disinterest of a creature that has been observing human behavior for a long time and has found it consistently unimpressive. I remember all of these details in the way you remember the surroundings of the most significant moments of your life, with a precision that the moments themselves sometimes cannot match. She turned. The recognition was instantaneous. There was no delay, no moment of her looking at a stranger. Her face knew me the way my face knew her, before the mind could intervene, and what happened to her face in that first second was the most frightening thing I have ever seen in another human being, because it was not surprise. It was terror. She went white in the way that people go white when the thing they have been afraid of for years arrives. Not the white of shock, the white of someone who has been expecting this moment and has none the less found it unbearable when it came. She said my name, just my name, Thomas, in a voice that was exactly her voice, the voice I had heard in my head for 9 years on the mornings when I woke up and for 3 or 4 seconds had forgotten what had happened, and she was still alive in those seconds, that voice. The man beside her looked between us, and I could see him reading the situation without knowing what he was reading, his hand moving slightly toward her, protective. I said, "Catherine," she said, "please." Just that word, please. And then she looked at the man beside her, and she said his name, which was David, and she said, "I need a few minutes." And the way she said it told him something that made him take a step back and look at me carefully, and then look at her and nod. And he walked to the edge of the market and stood there watching us. My legs did what I promised you they would do. I found a low wall at the edge of the market, and I sat on it, because the alternative was the cobblestones, and I was not willing to be on the cobblestones. Catherine came and stood in front of me. She was still holding the dahlias. Her face had gone from white to a specific shade I cannot name, but that I associated, in the years of our marriage, with the moments when she was about to say something that had cost her a great deal to be ready to say. She said, "I am so sorry." I said nothing. She said, "I know that is not enough. I know there is nothing I can say that is enough, but I need you to hear it first before anything else." I said, "You are alive." She said, "Yes." I said, "Emma." And her face did something I cannot describe, except to say that it was the face of someone who has been carrying a weight for 9 years that would have crushed most people. And the weight shifted when I said that name. She said, I know about Emma. I have kept track of Emma. I know she is in Edinburgh. I know she teaches art now on Tuesdays at a community center there. I know she is happy with Callum. I know she had a cold last February that lasted 3 weeks. I looked at her. She said, "I have watched from a distance. I could not be there, but I could not be nowhere." I said, "The accident." She said, "Yes." I said, "The body." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There was a woman in the car, a woman whose identification I had taken." The fire made verification difficult enough that the records they requested were the records that confirmed what was already assumed. I thought about the dental records that had matched. I thought about what that sentence meant and what it required. I said, "Who was she?" Catherine said, "A woman I had known from the conference. She had a difficult situation. She had asked me for help. She needed to disappear from a man who was finding her regardless of where she went. The accident was genuine. She did not survive it. She had been driving my rental car because her own had broken down. Her identification was in my bag, which I had lent her for the afternoon." She paused. She said, "I saw the smoke from the highway. I knew immediately. And I stood on the side of that road, Thomas, and I made a decision that I have lived inside for 9 years. I said, 'Tell me.' She said, 'I was already gone, in the ways that mattered. You and I had been going through the motions of a marriage for years. You know that. I know you know that. We were not cruel to each other. We were not unhappy in the way of people who have chosen wrong. But we had become parallel lives in the same address, and I had been trying to find a way to say so for longer than I am proud of, and I could not find the words. And then the accident happened, and the decision was there, and I made it. I sat on the low wall in the Alfama market, and I looked at my dead wife, and I thought about what she had said. She was right that I had known. Some part of me had known, in the way that you know things you are not ready to hold directly. The marriage had been real once, and had become a structure that both of us maintained because the alternative required a conversation neither of us had been willing to begin. She was also wrong, not about what the marriage was, about what she had done with what the marriage was. I said, "Emma was 18. She said, "I know." I said, "Emma stood at your grave." She said, "Yes." I said, "Emma has believed for 9 years that her mother is dead." Catherine was quiet for a long time. The market moved around us. Someone was buying tiles. A child was running between the stalls. David was still at the edge of the market, not watching us now, giving us space with the dignity of a man who has learned that there are things he cannot manage for her. She said, "That is the part I have not been able to make peace with. I have made peace with leaving you. I have not made peace with leaving Emma." I said, "Then why have you not come back?" She said, "Because once you choose something like this, you do not get to unchoose it the moment it becomes inconvenient. Because the person who made that choice on the side of a highway is responsible for what it cost. Because showing up would not have given Emma her mother back. It would have given her the mother who left." I sat with that. I said, "She deserved to know." She said, "Yes, she deserved more than she got from me. She deserved a mother who stayed. I was not able to be that mother, and I am not asking you to forgive that. I am telling you the truth of it because you are here and you deserve the truth, even if the truth is not a thing that resolves into anything clean." I looked at her for a long time. I thought about 9 years of Emma calling me on the anniversary of her mother's death, and the two of us sitting in our separate lives on opposite sides of the Atlantic, with the grief of a woman who was standing in Lisbon holding dahlias. I thought about the Sunday morning routine that I had kept, without meaning to, for the first year after Catherine died, making coffee and sitting with the newspaper and feeling the absence of the other part of the routine in the specific way you feel the absence of something that was regular enough to have left a groove. I thought about the grave in Raleigh that we had chosen a headstone for, Emma and I, on a gray afternoon in May, standing in a cemetery office looking at a catalog of granite options, while neither of us said what we were thinking, which was that this is not real, this cannot be real, but it is. It is. I thought about David at the edge of the market, the way he had stepped back when she asked him to, the way he watched her without managing her. I said, "Is he good to you?" She looked at me, and something in her face shifted in a way I had not seen in our marriage, and I understood, seeing it, that whatever she had been in our life together, she had been less than she was capable of being, and that this was perhaps not only her fault but also mine, and that the things you suppress for long enough change shape. She said, "Yes, he is very good to me." I said, "How long?" She said, 6 years. We have been in Lisbon for 4. I said, "Are you happy?" She said, "Yes." And I know that is the most difficult thing I have said to you today. It was. I stood up from the wall. My legs held. I looked at her for one more long moment, the way you look at something you have to memorize because you do not know when you will see it again or whether you will see it again. I said, "Emma is going to have to know." She said, "I know." I said, "I am not going to tell her for you. This is yours to carry to her. But I am going to tell you that she needs to hear it, and I am going to give you a reasonable time to make that happen. And if you do not make it happen, I will make it happen, because she has spent 9 years grieving a woman who was alive." Catherine said, "I know. I will tell her. I have been preparing to tell her for 2 years. I have not been ready. I will be ready now." I said, "You should be." I walked away. I walked for a long time through streets I did not know, turning without deciding to turn, moving through the city the way you move when your body needs to cover ground, because standing still is not possible. I ended up at a viewpoint above the river, one of the miradoros that Lisbon places at intervals throughout the city, like rest stops for people who have encountered something too large to process indoors. I stood at the railing and looked at the water for a long time. I thought about what I felt, not the performance of what I was supposed to feel, the actual inventory. There was anger. I want to name it precisely, not the hot anger of betrayal, which I expected, but the cold and specific anger of a man who understands that the years of grief he carried were manufactured, that the weight he had given the best years of his middle life to, the loss that had reorganized his identity and his house and his capacity for ordinary happiness, had been a choice that someone else made for him without his consent. That anger was real, and I am not going to dress it up as something more philosophical than it was. There was also something else, something I found uncomfortable enough that I held it at a distance for a while before I looked at it directly. Relief. Not that she was alive, or not only that. Relief at the clarification. Relief at having the thing that had always been slightly sideways in my memory of the marriage confirmed from the outside. We were not what I had believed we were when I grieved her. What I had grieved was, in part, a version of the marriage that I had constructed in loss, polished by absence into something rosier and more complete than it had actually been. She was not the woman I had made her into in 9 years of grief. She was the actual woman standing in a market, alive, with her own reasons and her own life and her own irresolutions. That was harder than the myth. It was also truer, and beneath both of those, deeper and quieter than either, was something I could not fully name yet and am still not sure I can name now. Something like, "The world is stranger and more intact than I had let myself believe. I called Emma that evening from my hotel room. I did not tell her on the phone. I will not do that to you. On the phone was what I thought when I was deciding how to do this, and that decision took most of the afternoon. I told her I had something significant to tell her, that it was not a health emergency, that I was okay, but that it needed to be in person, and I was going to book a flight to Edinburgh on my way home from Lisbon, and I needed her to be available. She said, "Dad, you are scaring me." I said, "I know. I am sorry. I promise I am okay. The news is complicated, not catastrophic, not in the way you're afraid of." She said, "Okay." She said it the way Emma has said okay to me since she was a child, with more trust than I have always been sure I deserved. I flew to Edinburgh 3 days later. Callum made himself absent with the discretion of a man who understands what presence and absence each require. Emma and I sat at her kitchen table, and I told her everything: the market, the flowers, the wall, the conversation, what Catherine had said about David, what she had said about watching Emma from a distance. Emma did not speak for a very long time. She is 28 years old, and she has her mother's way of going still when something is too large for immediate response. She sat with her hands around her coffee cup, and she looked at the table, and I waited. She watched me. I said, yes. She said, she knew about Callum. I said, yes. She said, she has been alive this whole time. I said, yes. Emma was quiet for another long moment. Then she said something I had not expected, and that I have thought about every day since she said it. She said, "Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." I said I would. She said, "Did you know?" Not that she was alive. I mean, did you know before the accident that she was unhappy enough to go? I thought about the question with the honesty it deserved. I said, I knew something was wrong. I did not know it was that wrong. I think I chose not to look at it directly. Emma said, I think she did too. I looked at my daughter. She said, I am not defending her. What she did to you and to me is not something I have words for yet, and I do not know if I will have words for it for a long time. But I also know that our family was not what I thought it was when I was growing up. I could feel that. I just didn't have the adult vocabulary to name it then. I said no. Neither did I. We sat at her kitchen table for another 2 hours. We talked about the marriage in a way we had never talked about it before, because before this afternoon it had been sealed inside grief, and grief had made it sacred in the way that only dead things can be sacred. Now it was open and complicated and very human, and we could look at it. At some point, Emma said, I want to talk to her. I said, I know. She said, not because I forgive her, I don't know yet if I forgive her, but because I need to hear it from her directly. I need to see her face when she says the things she said to you. I said, I will pass that on. Catherine called Emma 6 weeks later. I know this because Emma called me afterward. The conversation had lasted 3 hours. I am not going to tell you what was said because that conversation belongs to Emma and to whatever remains of Catherine's role as her mother, and it is not mine to characterize. What Emma told me was that it was the hardest conversation of her life and that she did not know if they would have any kind of relationship and that she needed time. She also told me one other thing. She said, Dad, she told me something about you. I said, what? She said, she told me that the best thing she did in the marriage was show up to that birthday party where you were arguing. She said she decided in the first 5 minutes that you were worth the trouble. She said she was right about that, even when she was wrong about everything else. I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said, "That sounds like her." Emma said, "She said to tell you she was sorry, not for the things she already said sorry for on the street, for the years, for what the grief cost you. She said she has no right to ask for your forgiveness, and she is not asking. She wanted you to know she knows what it cost." I thought about that sentence for several weeks. It is now 14 months since Lisbon. I am still in Raleigh, in the house that has no associations. I went back to work for a further 6 months after the trip, and then retired properly at the end of the year, not from crisis or from loss, but from the simple and clear-eyed assessment that I had enough and the work was no longer where the interesting part of my life was happening. Emma is still in Edinburgh. She and Catherine have spoken twice more in the months since the first call. I do not ask for details, and Emma does not provide them unsolicited. What I know is that Emma is okay, that the information, which I had feared would destabilize her, has done something more complicated and ultimately more useful than destabilization. She said last month that knowing the truth felt like finding out the house you grew up in had a room you never knew about. Unsettling, but also in some way larger than you thought. I have not spoken to Catherine again, not because there is nothing to say. There is probably a great deal to say. But I am 58 years old, and I have a limited supply of the kind of emotional labor that the conversation would require, and I have decided to spend it on the people and the things that are actually present in my life. I have started taking the Sunday mornings back, not the routine that belonged to the marriage, a different version. Coffee still, because coffee is not a marital artifact. But I read history now, the long kind, the kind that puts the current century into a frame large enough that the specific disasters of your specific life look like what they are, which is small and human and survivable. I think about Lisbon. I think about standing at the Miradoro above the river after the market, with the water below and the other bank in the distance, and the particular light of a September afternoon in a city that does something to you if you come to it alone. I think about the 30 seconds when I stood on the cobblestone street and recognized my dead wife, and the floor of the world dropped away a second time, the way it had dropped away in the hospital call, but differently, because this time what dropped was not the world, but a version of the world that I had been maintaining for 9 years, and that had been, in some important and unexamined way, a story I told myself rather than a thing that was actually there. I am not the same man who sat in that grief counselor's office in 2015. I am not the same man who stood in a cemetery choosing headstone granite with his 18-year-old daughter. I am not even the same man who booked a 10-day trip to Lisbon because a colleague said the city required solitude to receive properly. I do not know what I am exactly. I am working on that. I have the time for it now. I have the quiet. I have the Sunday mornings and the reading and the smaller house and the occasional call from Emma that lasts longer than expected and goes to places neither of us would have gone before that afternoon at her kitchen table. I have the knowledge that the woman I grieved for 9 years is alive and walking in a city I can now picture completely, buying dahlias in a market in the Alfama with a man who is good to her, carrying the weight of what she chose and what it cost, as she will carry it. That is a stranger and harder and more complete truth than the one I had before I got on the plane. And I have found in the 14 months since that complete is worth more than clean. Almost always, the full truth, however jagged, is worth more than the smooth version that fits in a frame. If you have ever had the ground pulled from under you twice, and if the second time turned out to be more complicated than the first, and if you are still standing after both, then you already know what this story is really about. Not betrayal, not survival. The particular work of a man who has to find out, after everything, who he is when the story he told about his life turns out to have had a different ending all along. That work does not finish. But it is the most honest work I have ever done. I want to tell you what I did not expect about the aftermath of Lisbon, because expectations are part of this story, and mine were almost all wrong. I did not expect that the anger would be as clean as it was. When I imagined, in the abstract, discovering that someone I loved had deceived me on that scale, I imagined something that would be corrosive, something that would eat through the other things, the memories and the good years and the real moments, and leave them damaged beyond recognition. What I found was different. The anger was present, and it was real, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But it was also bounded. It had an object and an explanation, and it did not spread in the way I had feared. Perhaps because the explanation, however devastating, was also clarifying. She left because the marriage had become something neither of us could name honestly. She was wrong to leave the way she left. She was not wrong that there was something to leave. Those two things can both be true. I had to learn to hold them both. I did not expect that Emma would be the one to make me see it most clearly. I had been Emma's father for 28 years, and I had always thought of her as someone I protected from difficult truths rather than someone capable of generating them. The afternoon at her kitchen table reorganized that. She sat across from me with her coffee, and she said things about our family that I had not been prepared to hear, and that were, when I actually heard them, completely accurate. She had been watching our marriage from the inside of it for the years of her childhood, and she had seen things that I, as one of the two people inside it, had been too close to see. Children often do. We do not give them enough credit for what they observe and understand and choose not to say. I did not expect to feel, underneath everything, a kind of bizarre and guilty gratitude that she was alive. Not that she had done what she did, not the method or the cost of it, but the simple biological fact. The woman I had grieved was in the world. She was in Lisbon with a man who was good to her, building a life that suited the version of herself that our marriage had not been large enough to contain. There is something in me that refused to be entirely sorry about that, and I have examined that refusal carefully enough that I no longer think it is weakness or self-deception. I think it is the response of a person who loves someone genuinely and is, at some uncontrollable level, glad they exist. I did not expect to go back to Lisbon, but I have booked a trip for the spring, not to find her, not to continue any conversation, to go back to the city that held the moment, the way you return to a place where something important happened, not to recreate the event, but to stand in the space of it again and understand it from a different distance. The bookshop will still be there. The woman reading 3 books simultaneously will probably still be there. The bench in the garden where I read on the third afternoon and felt, briefly and completely, like a man with no unfinished history, will still be there. The Miraduro above the river where I stood after the market and looked at the water for a long time will still be there. I want to stand at that railing again. I want to look at the water and the other bank and the light that is different every hour, and I want to see what I see from the other side of knowing what I know now. I think I will see the same water. I think it will look from the other side very much the same, and I think that is the thing, finally, that I have been trying to say. The world does not rearrange itself for the size of what has happened to you. The river is still the river. The light is still the light. The city is still the beautiful, indifferent, generous city it was on the day you arrived knowing nothing and the day you left knowing too much. And you are still standing. That is enough. In my experience, it is always enough. See you in the next one.